The Old Testament is an enigmatic work. It is both a book of ancient history and a collection of rules that gave birth to a religion, Judaism. It is also the source of Christianity and, several centuries later, inspired the Quran, Islam's founding text. Its characters have accompanied the West for over 2,000 years. Our imaginations have been carried away by its stories. But what exactly is contained in this book? Where was it written, and by whom? Modern science has shone a new light on these questions, on the basis of findings drawn from stones and from the land. A recent revolution in the area of archaeology has transformed the idea we once had of the society that put the Old Testament into writing. The investigation we are about to carry out was triggered by this revolution. The sun rises over the lands of Canaan. Lands where, according to the Bible, lived the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Our investigation is about to begin, at the beginning. Their stories are told in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Israel Finkelstein, a researcher at the Archaeology Institute of the University of Tel Aviv, has had joint charge of excavations in Megiddo in the north of Israel for almost 10 years. About 100 specialists and volunteers from all over the world are involved in this undertaking. Megiddo is the jewel of biblical archaeology. Its history goes back over 7 millenniums of contacts and conflicts between the great powers that dominated the region in turn: Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, followed by the Persian Empire. Megiddo is a tell, an artificial hill created from layers of homes, palaces, and temples that were built over each other during the centuries. The name Megiddo is often cited in the Bible. For Christians, it represents Armageddon, the site of the apocalypse. Many archaeological expeditions have been embarked upon on the basis of these biblical references. In 1903, the German archaeologist Gottlieb Schumacher organized the first digs here. vast quantities of material. In the 1920s to 30s, U.S. billionaire John Rockefeller financed an archaeological mission by the University of Chicago. The mission was aimed at carrying out a methodical investigation. Thanks to the hundreds of workers recruited at the site or in Egypt, the mission was able to reach bedrock in this huge trench, which measures 20 meters in width and is 15 meters deep.
This is a key for understanding the history of Megiddo and the history of the entire country. It is a unique opportunity which was given to us by earlier excavators. There's this incredible section going all the way down to bedrock, giving you a history of about 7,000 years, from bedrock down there all the way up to the 5th century BC. 20 strata, in fact more than that, 25 cities built one on top of the other. A unique situation. There's nothing like that anywhere else in the entire region, even beyond the borders of this country. And this opens a window for us into the belly of the mound and a window into the book, open book, the history of Megiddo in the Bronze and Iron Ages, and the history not only of Megiddo, the history of the entire country.
An unparalleled site that is the cradle of biblical archaeology, Megiddo serves as a reference for the dating of sites throughout the whole of the Near East. Located at a strategic and economic crossroads between Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, Megiddo is going to play a crucial role in our investigation. The Old Testament is the name commonly given to the Hebraic Bible. It is essentially a religious book. For many centuries, it was considered as being unnecessary and even dangerous to question the historical events related in its pages. This attitude would change as a result of what are known as the Lights. The Bible would undergo a rereading on the basis of tools provided by science and reason.
Mid-19th century Germany saw a critical exegesis of the Bible, which triggered reactions particularly in England. This ultimately led scholars to come to Palestine in an attempt to use archaeology in order to prove the historical veracity of the biblical texts.
Researchers, most often from European and U.S. religious circles, worked throughout the region looking for evidence to prove the historical nature of the Bible. They included Fathers Lagrange, Abel, and Vincent. Edward Robinson, a theologian trained in the Semitic languages, identified dozens of sites that have retained practically the same names for 2,500 years. These adventurers drew up the first biblical maps of the Holy Land. Little by little, methodical excavations were set up in the area. According to an expression popular at the time, the archaeologists carried a spade in one hand and a Bible in the other. They were the originators of both a method and a state of mind, biblical archaeology.
It would take quite some time before biblical archaeology fell out of favor. As late as the 1930s, the American archaeologist William Foxwell Albright was convinced that his archaeological research would enable him to prove the historical veracity of the Bible. And this movement continued practically until 1960.
The approach has still not completely disappeared. But in recent years, researchers have opened up a new path that has transformed archaeology into an independent scientific discipline. These specialists consider architectural vestiges, ceramics, and debris of all types as the elements in a huge tableau vivant, a human reality that has to be sampled, understood, and interpreted in scientific terms.
He was very satisfied that the trough is still in place. He thinks that it's nice and it should be kept in place. It's this one over here, this trough.
How has this new approach changed what we know about the origins of the Old Testament? This is the investigation being carried out by Israel Finkelstein in Megiddo and in the Levant's archaeological sites. Allowing these books of stone to shed light on a work of paper. The Bible is the world's most widely read book. Its specialists include exegetes, epigraphs, specialists in literature, linguists, historians, and theologians. Thomas Romer is a professor of the Old Testament at the Lausanne Faculty of Theology. He will be our guide with respect to this work.
What is the Hebraic Bible? First of all, it is obviously the founding text of Judaism. It is also the text that is at the origin of three monotheisms: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In more precise terms, it is the history of the Hebraic people, a national history that begins with the Patriarchs and goes through to the royalty. But this national history also became a universal history through the prophets and by being opened up to other nations. So the Hebraic Bible is both a very specific book related to the Hebraic people and, due to its acceptance and enlargement, a book that carries a universal message.
The Old Testament is composed of a series of books, which is the very definition of the word Bible, ta Biblia, which in Greek means the books. It is a collection of legal texts, poems, and moral reflections, and a history book of the creation of the world and the people of Israel. It was the first book ever to be printed. Like all great religious texts, it is a controversial document that has been used by some to justify wars and invasions, and by others to deliver a message of peace. Its wealth is such that it is never far from the minds of our archaeologists. It is not possible to carry out digs in the Holy Land without being conscious of the gravity of the situation. Israel Finkelstein, an archaeologist, and Neil Silverman, a historian, have decided to write a book together that will compare the discoveries made by archaeology with the most famous of biblical stories. They know they are embarking on a very sensitive mission.
The Bible, of course, is one of our most important ancient Near Eastern texts, but it's got a larger significance than that, obviously. It's a ancient text that is the core of the religion of hundreds of millions of people all over the world. So we are aware of the sensitivities of the Bible, but what we're trying to do is bring the most modern discoveries, the best insights that we can, to help the understanding and really transform the modern understanding of what the Bible really represents in its ancient context.
Their book provides the outline for our investigation and its chronology, from the most distant times to the most recent periods.
Voilà un des volumes de cette Bible ancienne du XVIIe siècle, imprimée à Londres, et polyglotte, comme vous souhaitiez.
The first 5 books of the Old Testament make up what is called the Pentateuch, or the Torah in Hebrew. They are particularly important for those who proclaim monotheism and are common to both Judaism and Christianity.
The Hebraic Bible begins with a universal story. The first 11 chapters tell the story of creation, the creation of human beings and the world, and also the origin of violence. Cain and Abel, the flood, and the origin of the diversity of our languages and of humanity in the Tower of Babel. Then suddenly in chapter 12 we turn to something else, the story of Abraham and thus the origins of the Hebraic people, with this call that Abraham receives from God.
ויאמר אדוני אל אברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך.
The Lord said unto Abraham, leave this land and your ancestors, the house of your father, and go to the land that I will show you.
The Bible describes the patriarch Abraham, his wife Sarah, and his nephew Lot leaving their land with their herds and heading for the Promised Land in response to a divine order. The biblical text describes a veritable migration over thousands of kilometers from Mesopotamia toward Egypt and then Canaan. In accordance with the Romantic and Orientalist conceptions of the period, 20th century researchers imagined Abraham as a Bedouin, similar to those that could then be seen in the Holy Land. According to them, the biblical story described a lifestyle that was typical of the region.
When scholars sought a date for the biblical patriarchs, they basically relied on a certain number of elements contained in the texts that took us back to around 1800 BC. This obviously means that they relied only on biblical facts and not on facts that were external to the Bible. Even today, many people imagine that Abraham lived around 1800 BC.
1800 BC is a period referred to by archaeologists as the Middle Bronze Age. We have to go back to Megiddo. What can the Book of Stone tell us about this? We will focus our investigation in the heart of the site, on the strata dating from the Middle Bronze Age. By going down to the lower pages of Megiddo, Israel Finkelstein takes us back in time. He arrives at the ruins of the city that corresponds to the second millennium. What he finds there is surprising. At that time, Megiddo was an important administrative, cultural, and economic center with monumental buildings, fortifications, and temples. Far from being an arid landscape suitable only for herders, the strata of the period corresponding to Abraham's migration reveal a city-state of almost 2,000 inhabitants. At that time, Canaan was an economically developed region with a very dense network of city-states. Doubts are raised about the chronology that has been proposed by traditional interpretations of the Bible. But what of the migration itself? Canaan is a buffer zone situated between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and these empires have left a number of vestiges. Megiddo is one of the sites where such material abounds. This Book of Stone will allow us to read the ancient pages of the history of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Pages that are indispensable to the rest of our investigation. In Canaan, archaeology is for the large part a science of broken fragments and shattered vases. Their decorative style, dating, and use are elements that come together like a huge puzzle in order to reconstruct these societies. These fragments teach us about the origin of power and the social groups active at that time. They suggest both distant and near influences, desires, fears, and daily life from the relevant time. Like these small engraved cylinders that were used as seals or amulets, and in which we can see the rites that were then popular in Mesopotamia and the Levant unfolding before our eyes.
At Megiddo, we have evidence for the influence of the northern powers, the northern civilizations, I mean Mesopotamian and Syrian, throughout history, from the late 4th millennium to the 1st millennium BC. This means that they had an impact on the events in the Levant throughout, and that it is impossible to reconstruct the history of this region without taking into consideration the northern civilizations, Mesopotamian and Syrian.
There are many links in the stories of the patriarchs with the people of the north, that is, the Arameans. We have Jacob and his uncle Laban, who ended up there, and we can see that they have family ties there, as well as more complicated conflictual links. Territories had to be mapped out, and it was not always an easy task. The north is also mentioned when Abraham is about to leave, as he comes from Haran, which was a very important Aramaic town.
The biblical text describes the migration of Abraham as a break with his own civilization. But is the hypothesis that the patriarchs originated in Mesopotamia a plausible one? One of the answers lies perhaps in the countless archives and testimonials of Mesopotamian civilization that are today to be found disseminated throughout the world's greatest museums. We have here a panorama of the civilization and empires that followed one another in Mesopotamia over the millenniums. alongside these monuments that rise up from the sands, we find thousands of tablets covered in cuneiform symbols, writings in clay that cover several thousands of years, some of which date from the 2nd millennium BC. Will Neil Silberman be able to find the traces of Abraham's story in these tablets? The thousands of tablets dug up from the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers form a gigantic database that has to be deciphered, a task that is still ongoing. In the 1920s, an English archaeologist, Leonard Woolley, began digs at Ur, the village where Abraham originated. A number of clues appeared to be quite conclusive. William Albright, a U.S. scholar, believed that he had identified the historical framework for the Patriarchs story. He claimed that a vast migration, that of the Amorites, a nomadic people from Mesopotamia, led to the destruction of urban culture in the Levant around 2000 BC. Neil Silberman is at the School of Applied Higher Studies in Paris.
The early scholars attempted to place Abraham in a historic context of the Amorite invasions. But do we believe that this could be true today?
The Amorites are a people that are well documented at the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 2nd millenniums, and it was very tempting to link Abraham's migration with that of the Amorites. However, the Amorite migrations primarily occurred in a west-east direction, whereas Abraham, in contrast, went from east to west. As a consequence, the link is not as obvious as was once thought.
It now appears to be well accepted. There was no migration in the direction of Canaan at the time that the Bible situates Abraham's voyage. But new discoveries in the ruins of Mari and Nuzi relaunched the investigation on Abraham. Over 20,000 cuneiform tablets have been excavated in Mari. They contain certain biblical names, such as Yasmach El, which could be Ishmael, Yaqub El for Jacob, and most importantly, Abiram for Abraham.
For a long time, it was thought that the name of Abraham could be linked to the period around 1800, when the name was cited in a certain number of texts. However, the sudden increase in the number of texts available meant that there was clear evidence that the name was widely used not only around 1800, but in the centuries that followed. So there was no real proof of the relevant time period for this biblical patriarch.
As the tablets were gradually deciphered, new theories appeared, most of which tried to prove the existence of Abraham in the 2nd millennium BC. John Van Seters, an internationally recognized expert, has been working on the Nuzi tablets for a long time. The tablets contain a story similar to that of Sarah, Abraham's barren wife in the Bible.
how to account for a barren woman who gives her maidservant to her husband in order to bear children for her. Something of this kind seemed to show up in the Nuzi tablets. And so the scholar said, aha, here we have something. Here we have a way of linking Abraham with this particular period. And this was very attractive, but there were some problems. The problems was that scholars were so concentrated on the documents of the second millennium that they forgot to look at the documents in the first millennium. And when one looked through the same kind of literature, the same kind of archival documents of the first millennium, the same customs show up in these texts. Taking all of these things together, they really prove absolutely nothing. There's just no firm evidence that can pin down the patriarchs and Abraham into a particular period in the second millennium.
In this way, traditional biblical archaeology reached a dead end in terms of the Abraham story.
So what we see is that the whole concept of roaming the land with the Bible in one hand and the spade in another in order to look for the patriarchs doesn't work. In a domino effect, one theory after the other collapse. So the problem is not in this theory or that theory. The problem is in the way of thinking, in the concept. The idea of old traditional biblical archaeology does not work, is wrong. And I think that now we have to go back to the text, to the book of Genesis, in order to understand the reality of the period of the patriarchs on the background of the period of the writing.
Nevertheless, the Old Testament can still be used by historians. It suffices to know how to identify the clues contained in the book, the names of places or people, typical landscapes. In the book of Genesis, reference is made to the Philistines, a people who came to Canaan and who made life difficult for the Israelites. What do we know of the Philistines? That they are part of a group of peoples whose origin is unknown, who came to the coastal plains of the Levant and who were given the name the Sea Peoples. Neil Silberman met with an Israeli archaeologist in digs in Dor, not far from Megiddo, a site that relates to these sea peoples. She is trying to identify them and determine their date of arrival.
What can we say about the date of the arrival of the Philistines and the other sea peoples?
Well, other than the Bible, when they are mentioned earlier, both archaeologically and if we take into consideration the literature, they appear on the scene in the 12th century BC. It is roughly 1200 or 1150 BC.
So in the earlier periods, when it's mentioned in connection with Abraham, there's just not archaeological evidence. Everything comes later.
No, none whatsoever. Archaeologically, everything starts in the 12th. Some would say a little bit earlier, maybe the late 13th century.
The biblical verses that associate the patriarchs with the Philistines presuppose a world that dates from after the 12th century BC. Let us continue with our investigation. The stories of the Bible often refer to camels. There are 25 references to this animal in Genesis, most of which have some connection with Abraham. Camels were obviously a well-known animal in the Near East, and archaeological excavations have revealed significant quantities of camel bones. But our objective is to put a date on these events. Israel Finkelstein has gone to see Ladar Sapir of the University of Tel Aviv's Archaeozoological Laboratory.
What do we know about the domestication of the camel in the Levant region?
According to the archaeological evidence, the camel could not have been domesticated as a beast of burden before the first millennium BC.
A second piece of evidence has therefore arisen that contradicts the biblical texts. The camels of the Near East were not used as working animals before 1000 BC. Before this period, we can find no trace or representation of this animal on vases, ceramics, or monumental decors. But our investigation doesn't end there. The presence of camels is linked to the caravan trade from Arabia. The biblical texts state that these caravans transported gum tragacanth, ointments, and labdanum. The Assyrian tablets and archaeology show that the caravan routes linking Arabia to the Levant coast went through the kingdom of Judah. This trade, which required many camels, reached its height in the 7th century BC. The caravans described in the story of Joseph, the son of the patriarch Jacob, therefore refer to a reality of the 7th century when the Assyrian Empire dominated the tiny kingdom of Judah.
So now that we look at Genesis, we know that Genesis does not describe the background of the 18th century. We are not in the Middle Bronze Age. There are enough anachronisms there about the Philistines, about the camels, that show us that we are not in an environment of the Middle Bronze. Instead, it is clear that we are in the 7th century BC. All the details, or many of the details in Genesis, fit perfectly the 7th century BC. So we have already answered one question, when? But there's still another question, why? We need to look at the authors of Genesis and ask the question, why did they tell the story of Genesis in this way?
The fact that the biblical texts state that Abraham left Mesopotamia for the Holy Land tells us nothing about the authors of the text. Our investigation will therefore now turn to the ultimate destination of his migration.
According to the biblical story, Abraham arrived from the north. He traveled through important sites in the north, but finally came to settle in Hebron. His settlement in Hebron was, in fact, confirmed by Abraham's acquisition of a tomb from the inhabitants of the area.
The names of biblical places attracted the attention of a German researcher who in the 1940s made an inventory of all the places where the patriarch stories took place. His name was Martin Noth. The Bible tells us that Abraham, a nomad, bought some land near Hebron in which to die, but also in which to live. The story tells of the appearance in an oak grove in Mamre of 3 of God's messengers who announced to Abraham's wife, who has been barren up until then, that she was to have a child. God appeared to Abraham under the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at his tent door at noontide. And lifting up his eyes he saw, and behold, 3 men stood before him. Hebron and Mamre are located in the center of Canaan, at the heart of its rocky hills. Continuing his geographical reading of the Bible, Martin Noth became interested in the second patriarch, Isaac, the son of Sarah and Abraham. Isaac played a role in a very famous scene. Responding to a call from God, Abraham agreed to sacrifice Isaac, only to be replaced at the very last moment by an animal. The Bible tells us that Isaac was a shepherd living in the semi-arid south of Canaan. Martin Noth then turned to the third patriarch, Jacob. The biblical text tells us that he had to go to the north to the site of his original family in order to choose a wife. On his return journey, he entered into battle with an angel near a river that runs in the northeast of the country. According to the Bible, it was during the combat with God's angel that he received a new name, Israel, he who battles with God. Other texts relating to him are situated in the mountainous regions of the north of Canaan. The geography of the 3 patriarchs led Martin Noth to suggest a reading of the Bible that was different to the traditional one.
On the basis of these geographical sites, it is understandable that an attempt was made to link them to each other. As history developed, an understanding was sought of how these groups of humans related to each other. This led to a sort of patriarchal genealogy with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was quite obvious that there were originally 3 quite separate traditions. The patriarchs were in fact not related. In the north, the story of Jacob was told. In Hebron, the story of Abraham. And in Beersheba, the story of Isaac. The idea that these 3 patriarchs were from one and the same family was, in fact, an invention after the fact by those who wrote the Bible. They wanted to show that there was a link between these 3 patriarchs, whereas in fact there was none.
Does this testify to a diversity in the oral traditions or in those of the texts? As of the 19th century, German biblical exegesis revealed that Genesis contained a number of stories of various origins that were woven together. Some were linked to the kingdom in the north, Israel, and others to the kingdom in the south, Judah.
So there are 3 different traditions set on the background of 3 different geographical zones. And the question is, why Abraham in the center? Why Abraham is put first? The answer is clear. We are in Jerusalem and Judah in the 7th century, in the period of the Judahite kingdom. So, regardless whether the patriarchs are historical or mythical, the most important fact is that the background of the story shows us that we are in the 7th century, in Judah, in Jerusalem, and the people who wrote this decided to put Abraham first as the founder of the family, as the center of the story, and by that also Judah as the center of the universe.
The Bible contains many long genealogies, lists of generations and family alliances that define territories and structure time.
The history of the patriarchs in the Bible is also a family history. Abraham was not only Isaac's father, he was also Ishmael's father, who was at the origin of all Arab tribes. And Isaac is not only Jacob's father, he is also Esau's father. And then Abraham is also Lot's uncle. This means that all the different peoples, clans, and tribes that live in Canaan and in Cis and Transjordan are linked by being descendants of Abraham. So all these people are presented as being part of one great family, with the problems faced by all families, but also the idea of a profound link between all these different peoples.
According to the biblical texts, many of the peoples and neighboring kingdoms are related to Judah. The long family saga of the Bible, as in any extended family tree, weaves the links that unite these peoples. But it also does more than that.
And what we see in the figure of Abraham is a symbolic representation of the birth of the nation. Because at the time of the writing of the Bible, the history of the people of Israel was not considered to be history in the sense that we understand it, of years, of periods, of particular historical events. It was seen more as the history of a family. And of course, the father of the family, the founder of the family, is a person of great significance. And throughout all the stories of Abraham, we see symbolic representations of the places of importance of Judah, of the kinds of relationships with other people that made Judean history.
The story of the patriarchs is the first pillar of what would later become Judaism, and that is common roots. According to Jewish tradition, the group known as the people of Israel is made up of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In their eyes, belonging to a people and to a religion is one and the same thing. Our investigation has taken us forward a great step. The facts we have gathered allow us to establish the period in which the stories of the patriarchs were first written and provides a geographical framework for this work. The region of Judah in the 7th century BC. But these books of stone have not finished raising questions about the work of paper. Did the Exodus, a central event in the Old Testament, really take place? Did those who were called the Hebrews go to Egypt? And did they leave under the command of a certain Moses? What role has been played by the law in this story? These questions will be the subject of our investigation in the second episode of our series.